Now, these are things the ADL does not want heard in public again, nor for the fact that they spied on the National Association of Colored People, NAACP, Irish Northern Aid, the Asian Law Caucus. Every progressive organization was spied on. They kept files in every progressive organization, including progressive Jewish organizations as well. And any organization that could take a position that might affect Israel was spied on. That included environmental organizations as well. And so this is why I'm able to speak, because I didn't sign a confidentiality agreement. So when it comes to really civil rights, they're a fraud. They're a fraud. And they have this reputation as being, fighting anti-Semitism, but in fact, they, like other groups in the pro-Israel community, they need anti-Semitism the way the Drug Enforcement Agency needs drug users. Then Pete McCloskey got an unusual witness for us to depose, Victor Ostrovsky. Victor Ostrovsky was a former Mossad agent, and he had written a book, Beyond Deception, and he was living in Canada. And Pete McCloskey, our attorney, wanted to get him to come down and make a deposition and see what he could contribute to the case. So this took place in Redwood City. If you could have been there in filming this, you would have seen the hatred of these attorneys for the ADL, all of whom were Jewish, against Ostrovsky. They literally wanted to kill the guy. And what was their first demand? They demanded of Ostrovsky, now mind you, this is an American Jewish organization, that he turn over to them all the papers he had taken from Mossad when he had left Mossad. If you want to get a connection between the ADL and Mossad, it was right there. The ADL story. In 1987, a friend of mine, labor activist named Steve Zeltzer, and I started a committee called the Labor Committee on the Middle East. The idea was to focus on Israeli mistreatment of Palestinian workers inside Israel as well as in the occupied territories, and also to deal with other workers' issues in the Middle East, including Israeli workers. And at our first meeting, there was a fellow came to the meeting named Roy Bullock. Now, I knew Roy Bullock because he was also a member of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, the ADC, and I had seen him around, but I didn't really know him. I'd said hello to him. Bullock was also a member of something called the Moses Mayakiso Defense Committee. Moses Mayakiso was a South African union activist who had been imprisoned by the apartheid regime, and Steve was very active in that. And so Steve had mentioned to him that we were starting the Labor Committee on the Middle East, and so Roy Bullock attended the first two meetings at Steve's house. Shortly thereafter, I received in the mail an envelope without a return address that contained a page torn out of the publication, I believe it was, of the Institute for Historical Review, which is an organization that essentially, they're called revisionist. If they don't deny the Holocaust, they try to minimize it. And in that page, however, said that Roy Bullock had been working as an agent for the Anti-Defamation League for the last 25 years. This was in 1987. And then he had attended the conference of the Institute for Historical Review, the most recent conference. And this was very troubling to me, that somebody who would be connected to the ADL had infiltrated our organization. And even though I rejected this organization, the Institute for Historical Review, the fact is you get truth from many sources, even some ugly sources. And in this case, I believed it was true. I had a hunch it was true. It had too much information, so Steve and I contacted Roy, and we met him at a cafe in San Francisco. And I had done a little research before we met and found out that Roy had turned up at Palestinian meetings all around the country. So we sat down in this cafe in the Mission District in San Francisco, and I showed him the article and asked him what he thought about it. He said, "It's not true." I said, "Were you at the meeting of the Institute for Historical Review that they say you were?" He says, "Yes, I was." I said, "What were you doing there?" He said, "Well, I was trying to recruit members for the ADC." I said, "Don't you realize that the last place that the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee would want members from is from the Institute for Historical Review?" "Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that." And I said, "How come you're interested in the Palestinian subject?" He said, "Well, I had a brother who used to work in Saudi Arabia." "Oh, of course, that explains it, right?" And he said, I said, "Well, I've done a little checking, Roy, and it seems that you turn up at Palestinian conferences all around the country. How do you account for that?" He said, "Well, I'm an art dealer, and I just happen to be, I travel around the country buying art, Japanese art, and that happens to be, I happen to be there, just a coincidence. And actually, to prove it, I'll give you the names of 2 art galleries, and you could call them for references." And he wrote on a piece of paper, or I wrote down a piece of paper, the names and phone numbers of these 2 galleries. That turned out to be a very important piece of paper, which I'll get to in a moment. So after we left, Steve and I decided this guy was an agent. His answers were flimsy. His argument was certainly didn't explain himself well enough, even if he was an art dealer. So I would see him still coming to conferences and meetings, and I would tell people that he was an ADL agent. And they would say, "Jeff, you shouldn't say things like that about people." I said, "I don't usually do that, but I have good reason to believe that he is." And he would be standing right there. And then, for example, at a conference in Berkeley, on an anti-apartheid conference, a big conference, there was Roy sitting in the corner of a room with a big legal tablet, just taking a lot of notes. And I told the people running this conference, I said, "This guy is an ADL agent." They said, "Jeffrey, don't say things like that. If you don't have proof," I said, I have enough belief that he is. I'm just telling you that." Well, it turns out the reason he was at the anti-apartheid conference is that he was also working as an agent for the South African intelligence. At the same time, he was working for the ADL. And actually, in his testimony, he said to the FBI that it wasn't any more work for him because he's already doing the same kind of work for the ADL. Because the ADL considered the African National Congress, because of his supporting the PLO, as a terrorist organization, and his publications, in fact, said that, or a communist organization, both. So this was 1987. And then 1988, I saw Roy holding the microphone for a fellow named Carl Fenimore, who was one of the organizers of a march in San Francisco against the U.S. intervention in Central America and against apartheid. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and it turns out that Roy had volunteered to work in their office, the mobilization office, as they were organizing this march. Now, the mobilization had a problem. Even though these organizations, including Fenimore's organization, Socialist Action, claimed to be anti-Zionist, and indeed their publication showed that, when it came to linking the Palestinian issue with other issues, they refused to do that. They were adamantly against doing that. And so this was 4 months after the first Intifada had begun, and I and some other folks were going to go to a general meeting that was called by the mobilization and demand that now, 4 months into the Intifada, the Palestinian issue had to be on the agenda. So they canceled the meeting. So we couldn't bring it to the general mobilization membership, so to speak. So then a group of us formed something called the Emergency Committee on Palestinian Rights. And we started getting petitions on signatures to get a plank dealing with the Intifada on the mobilization demand agenda. And so I personally sent in 3,000 signatures that other people had collected by certified mail to the mobilization office. Those names were taken off the petitions by the ADL spy Roy Bullock and entered into the ADL files as member of the Emergency Committee on Palestine, which never actually existed other than that for that particular reason. And so when the ADL files or the ADL spy story broke, people found that they were members of the Emergency Committee on Palestine that they never really thought they were members of. Now, it's interesting. Now, in 1992, 1991, the end of 91, a San Francisco policeman was arrested for spying on the Nation of Islam. And I was reading the story in the Examiner and the Chronicle, and somehow the cop looked familiar because I thought I had seen him with Roy Bullock. And so I called the Examiner reporter, who happened to be a neighbor of a woman, a member of our labor committee, and I said, does the name Bullock mean anything to you? And he said, boy, does it. All we have right now is the last name in a Gerard file. So I gave the Examiner the name of Roy Bullock and the names of the two art galleries that he gave me as a reference. And the Examiner broke the story. For that, I was attacked, my name editorially in the Jewish Weekly Forward and in the Jerusalem Post as part of what they call a red-brown alliance. They were comparing it to the alliance that they said existed between the communists and the Nazis to get Hitler into power. You know. At least they did allow me to write letters to the editor denying that. But that made me become the target. In any case, ABC then came out, and now they knew where Bullock lived. They followed him around Castro section where he lived in San Francisco. In any case, that's with Bullock now exposed. The FBI started, I don't know if he had already interviewed him or not before that, but he had not been mentioned in the press before. Then a group of us got together with attorney Pete McCloskey and filed a lawsuit against the ADL for spying under a provision of the California law, a narrow provision, a privacy law in which a organization like the ADL had no right getting non-public records, which they got from the police. Not only the police in San Francisco, but from San Diego and Los Angeles as well. And the San Francisco police were more cooperative with us in the case. Inspector Ron Roth, San Francisco Police Department, told our attorney Pete McCloskey, who himself had been a victim of the ADL, that 75% of the material in the ADL files was obtained illegally. Now, what was quite interesting is when ABC wanted to do their program, the district attorney, assistant district attorney, called my colleague, friend Steve Zeltzer, and said they want to interview someone, and I have your file. So Steve got his file from the ADL, from the district attorney's office, and he called me and he said, you're in my file. Your name's in my file. So I called the assistant DA, and I said, Steve Zeltzer just called me and said, my name is in your file, is an ADL file. Can I come and get my file? He said, sure, come on over. So immediately I went over and got the file from the assistant district attorney, and that very night, a judge put all the ADL files under seal, so no public person could see them, and they have been that way ever since. If I had not gone over to get my file, we would not have had a case, so I would never have seen my file. The case went on for 10 years. Pete McCloskey at one point estimated that the ADL has spent $8 million in lawyers. They had the best law firm in San Francisco, Heller, Ehrman, and McAuliffe. In a 34-story building in San Francisco, they had 19 floors. And the lead attorneys made so much money for them that the guy named Goldstein became the head of the firm. Now, it was interesting, over the 10 years that the case was in the courts, or actually not in the courts, but the negotiations were going back and forth, their lawyers were very friendly to what became, in the end, just 3 plaintiffs, Steve Zeltzer, myself, and Anne Poirier, who is active in the anti-apartheid movement. I should say the case was against ADL spying on those who had opposed Israeli occupation and South African apartheid, so it linked the 2 struggles. Steve and I were both involved in both of those struggles. So, as I say, when we would have court appearances, their attorneys were very friendly toward us. But then Pete McCloskey got an unusual witness for us to depose, Victor Ostrovsky. Victor Ostrovsky was a former Mossad agent, and he had written a book, Beyond Deception, and he was living in Canada. And Pete McCloskey, our attorney, wanted to get him to come down and make a deposition and see what he could contribute to the case. So this took place in Redwood City. If you could have been there and filming this, you would have seen the hatred of these attorneys for the ADL, all of whom were Jewish, against Ostrovsky. They literally wanted to kill the guy. And what was their first demand? They demanded of Ostrovsky, now mind you, this is an American Jewish organization, that he turn over to them all the papers he had taken from Mossad when he had left Mossad. If you want to get a connection between the ADL and Mossad, it was right there. And of course, Ostrovsky was not about to do that. But that was a very telling moment. It was interesting, the ADL demanded of me, imagine they've been spying on me, they demanded of me that I turn over to them all my old passports and address books. Of course, they weren't going to get them. Now, the case went on, and it could have been, none of us were interested in money. We were interested in just defeating the ADL on this and getting some kind of a victory. And the ADL, all along the way, insisted that if anything agreement was made, we would have to sign a confidentiality agreement, which is quite usual in the settlement of cases, that if you get some payment from the ADL or anybody else, you do not talk about the case in public. So after 10 years of going back and forth with the courts determined that Steve and I were limited purpose public figures. And that meant that the limited purpose was the issue of Palestine and South Africa, and that the ADL, as journalists, which they claimed to be, could literally keep files on us, but they couldn't do anything illegal. And the irony is that even though they had all this information from me, which was obviously taken from FBI files, CIA files, and a lot of it was erroneous. They had me going to Vietnam in 1965. When I actually had tried to go to, in 66 rather, I tried to go to Vietnam. I applied to the Paris office of North Vietnam to go there as a photographer, and I was turned down. But obviously the office was bugged or their mail was ripped, so I had written them a letter. I was living in Paris. But they said I'd gone to Vietnam. I was supposed to go to Cuba in 1969. They said I'd been to Cuba in 1969. I was actually supposed to go there. I was in Madrid, but the visa was in New York, and the Cubans were not competent enough to get the visa back to Madrid. And so I never went to Cuba. They had me living as a roommate in London with a member of the African National Congress, when in fact he was a Nigerian boyfriend of a German woman roommate who would bring her drugs. And then they had me marrying someone named Jacqueline Parnell in 1963, who I never heard of. So that's the level of their files. But what got the ADL is they had my social security number, ironically. And now at the very end, the court said I was the only person with a claim. And if the case was not settled by a certain Friday, the case would go to court. Now, the ADL did not want to go to court. And I was not anxious to go to court because I realized two things. One, the Privacy Act, which they had violated, was very narrow. So all the other things the ADL had done and which we learned about would not be allowed. I mean, the ADL lawyers would say they'd object, and their objections would be legitimate. We'd get very little coverage in the press because, as it was, after the immediate exposure of the ADL files, the story was muted in the press, and even when we did get our settlement, our names weren't even mentioned in the paper. And so on the Friday before, the ADL sent over a settlement. They were going to pay $150,000 to be divided among Pete, Ann, and Steve. Among Steve, Ann, and myself. And then Pete was doing this pro bono, so he would get a small percentage of that. So they sent the agreement over to Pete McCloskey's office for us to sign, and Pete looked it through and he said, "There's a confidentiality agreement here. My clients will not sign that. You better get another agreement over here, and you about 45 minutes to do it before the office closes." They already had another agreement ready with it. They just tried to slip it by. They thought we might just sign this and not realize what we were signing. It was very important for me because I do this radio program in KZYX up in Mendocino, and I talk about the Israel lobby, and I do interviews with people on subjects all over the world. The program's called Takes on the World. But the introduction, 15 minutes, 17 minutes, I talk a lot about the Middle East and also about the Israel lobby and Israel-Palestine issue. And when I first went up there, where I live is not Israeli-occupied territory. Mendocino County is not Israeli-occupied territory. So when they first started complaining, a handful of pro-Israel zealots up there about me, the station manager turned over their complaints to me, and I invited them all to be on the air. The four of them, all at once if they chose, or one, but they all declined to do that. And even together, they would not come on the air and argue with me about Israel-Palestine. So they complained to the ADL, as I found out. But the ADL will not come anywhere near me. So the ADL told them to monitor the situation, monitor what I say, because they know that if they come anywhere near me, I will, as I see on the radio, people say, "How can you say what you're saying on the radio and not get in trouble?" I said, "Well, the ADL won't come anywhere near me," and I say that on the air, because I will mention that their spy was spying on South African exiles in the anti-apartheid movement while he was working for the ADL, and not only did they not criticize him for that, but after the trial, after the case was finished, he had been paid illegally for 25 years through a cutout in Beverly Hills, a lawyer in Beverly Hills. The ADL put him directly on their payroll. So if they had any criticism about his working for South Africa, they should have said it publicly, but they didn't. Secondly, their spy, Roy Bullock, who is identified by Erwin Sewell, who had been the chief of Israeli Anti-Defamation League intelligence, described Bullock as his best fact finder in the whole country. And it turned out they also had similar fact finders in Atlanta and Chicago. He had the key to the office and the plan for the office of Alex Oda, a Palestinian American who was the chair of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee in Orange County, who was killed in a terrorist bombing of his office, and Roy Bullock had a key and a floor plan to his office. Now, these are things the ADL does not want heard in public again, nor for the fact that they spied on the National Association of Colored People, NAACP, Irish Northern Aid, the Asian Law Caucus. Every progressive organization was spied on. They kept files in every progressive organization, including progressive Jewish organizations as well. And any organization that could take a position that might affect Israel was spied on, and included environmental organizations as well. And so this is why I'm able to speak, because I didn't sign a confidentiality agreement. At one time I was on a panel at KPFK in Los Angeles. It was myself, Ralph Schoenman, who's another anti-Zionist Jew, and Shurna Gluck, who is an anti-Zionist Jew, has a program on KPFK, Pacifica Station in Los Angeles. And we were going to be debating about Zionism with three Zionists in Los Angeles, a rabbi, an activist, and someone from the Anti-Defamation League. Well, the person from the Anti-Defamation League pulled out and did not send a replacement, because I went down there with a thick file and they knew what I would say. And so it's like I have an amulet that protects me, at least to this point, from them going after me. I know a lot about their history. They have been spying on Americans, progressive Americans, at least since 1937, when they turned over the files, their files of the National Lawyers Guild, this progressive group of American lawyers, most of them, at least many of them who are Jewish, to the Martin Dies Committee, the first Un-American Activities Committee, headed by a man named Martin Dies, who was a notorious open anti-Semite. Then during the McCarthy period, the witch hunts, they acted as, Lenny Brenner had a term, they assisted former Jewish communists or people accused of being communists. They would be intermediaries with the committee to make sure that things went as smoothly as possible. So when it comes to really civil rights, they're a fraud. They're a fraud. And they have this reputation as being, fighting anti-Semitism, but in fact, they, like other groups in the pro-Israel community, they need anti-Semitism the way the Drug Enforcement Agency needs drug users. They're constantly taking polls about it to find out what the level of anti-Semitism is. And for example, if you think Jews have too much power, or just enough power or not enough power, you're anti-Semitic. And of course, we see manifestations of it all the time, with particularly the relationship between who's ever Prime Minister of Israel and who's ever President of the United States. We see the boss, at least from my perspective, is over there, not here. And we see the situation in Congress. The money goes to Congress, whether it doesn't matter what the economic situation is in the United States, Israel will always get its aid in full, and every politician, Republican or Democrat, who suggests that an across-the-board cut might include Israel has to soon backtrack. In any case, but it's interesting that people are afraid. There are a number of cases where people have been taken off the air because they've criticized Israel. We had a situation in San Francisco back in the 90s where on a public radio station, KALW, there was a journalist, a Welsh journalist named Colin Edwards. Colin Edwards had covered the UN conference when meeting that the State of Israel was approved. And he had worked for a Canadian Broadcasting Company. He had traveled around the world. And he was a scholar of not only the Nazi Holocaust, but also the collaboration of the Zionists before the Holocaust. And he did a program on KALW in San Francisco in which he documented the collaboration of the Zionists with the Nazis, which is, they know in Israel, it's quite well known in Israel, but American Jews don't know about it. and don't want to know about it, because it's a pretty ugly story. There's rationalizations can be made. In any case, he did the program. He got a complaint. The general manager got a complaint from the Israeli consulate here, and from a very important San Francisco politician, Quentin Kopp, who was a supervisor and later became an assemblyman and a judge. And they said this is anti-Semitism, and the general manager, who a fellow named Daniel Del Solar, who was otherwise progressive, caved and removed Colin Edwards' program from the air. So this is an example of what happens. Just this last week, Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst, was being interviewed on KGO. KGO has the biggest talk show in San Francisco. And Ray McGovern was being interviewed by programmer Pat Thurston. And he talked about his opinions of Israel and called it a terrorist state. And the Anti-Defamation League and the JCRC, Jewish Community Relations Council, complained to the station, and the station had to apologize. Back in 1984, when it was very easy to get Israeli critics of Israel interviews in the mainstream media here in the San Francisco Bay Area, as well as on TV and radio, I was able to get a man who is now a well-known film director in Israel, Sinai Petra, who is to be interviewed on the leading talk show, the morning show, the Owen Spann show in San Francisco. Sinai had been a member of Yesh Gavul, which was an Israeli resistance group. These were soldiers, reservists who refused to fight in the Lebanon War in 1982, or who had gone to Lebanon and then refused to return. And Sinai was actually one of the founders of Yesh Gavul. So I got him as a guest on the Owen Spann show. And Owen Spann was an apolitical person. He was a decent guy and open to everything. He had no political agenda. And of course, I had arranged to have Sinai on the air through his producer. So Sinai goes on the air. This is a year and a half after the Lebanon War started. And he tells the audience that what Israel was saying, that the Palestinians have been shelling Israel from across the border in Lebanon, was not true. He was stationed there, in fact, when the war started. And he goes on and was talked about the occupation and how he opposed it. And he talked about Yesh Gavul and the opposition in Israel. And then Owen Spann opened the telephones. And a man with a very heavy European accent called in and said, "Who's responsible for putting this communist on the air?" And Spann said, "I am." Of course, he wasn't, but he said, "I am," and that was the end of the Owen Spann show. He was replaced by a man named Ron Owens, 1984, still there, who was one of the leading Zionist spokesmen in San Francisco. He MCs the annual Israel Day in the Park every May to celebrate Israel's anniversary. And he had been a fill-in host before that. And I had run into him once before because I had gotten another Israeli resistor on the air, a professor in Israel named Avi Oz. And that day, Owen Spann was sick. And so Ron filled in on him, and here's Avi comes in. Avi had actually gone to Lebanon. He'd been a tank commander, and he described what he had seen. It was pretty ghastly. I interviewed Avi when I was over there as well. And Ron Owens was viciously attacking him in a very unprofessional manner, trying to say that Avi was lying about what he had seen and that Israel was justified in what it was doing. And it was extraordinary because I didn't know Owens was before that, and here's Avi coming here, and he's being told by a Jewish American what the truth is about what happened that Avi had actually seen. If it had been dealt with any other issue but Israel, he would have lost his job because it was particularly unprofessional hosting. I mean, now we see this with Glenn Beck or Mike Savage or Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity, but those people didn't exist in those days, and most broadcasters were very professional.
All these individuals you just mentioned, they're all very supportive of Israel, from Michael Savage on that far end to Sean Hannity? And
They all are, yes.
What's that about?
Pardon?
What is that about? Why? What's your sense?
One of the things, the Israel lobby, which represents maybe at the most a third of the Jewish community, they're what they consider Israel to be warm Jews. Warm Jews. The rest of the Jews might be Protestants, Muslim, or anything else. Even though they'll vote in a certain way, the votes are not key. There is a group of dedicated Jewish Americans who really are locked into believing Israel is the most important thing going. And they have been indoctrinated. Actually, their first target is themselves and other Jews, because that's why you read the Jewish press, you see ads in the Jewish press reminding people the Holocaust is around the corner. The Holocaust reminders are as much, if not more so, for American Jews as they are for non-Jews. And this is a power center. When you look at who are the major columnists, syndicated columnists around the country, the majority of them are Jews, and they're where they used to have Anthony Lewis on the New York Times, who was a liberal critic of Israel. He was replaced by Tom Friedman, who is liberal, but is not really a critic of Israel. And so these columnists are syndicated all over the country. So you go to West Virginia, or you go to Santa Rosa, and then the Washington Post the same. So then you have at the networks, the president of CBS is a guy named Leslie Moonves. He's a great nephew of Ben Gurion. You go around the media in key places. Now, all these people are not raging Zionists, but they know the way it works, and how and who they can go up against and who they can't. I'll give you a couple of stories. Back during the first Intifada, NBC did a great piece on the first Intifada. The news director, the head of the news department, NBC, was Jewish, and I forget his name at the moment, but came from a well-known family. And I wrote him a letter thanking him for allowing this to be on the air, and knowing what he was going to go through within the Jewish community, within the pro-Israel community, for having allowed this program to play. And he wrote a letter back to me expressing his appreciation for my letter. But he wrote this letter in longhand and pencil. And why did he not give it to his secretary? Because he knew or believed that AIPAC would have that letter. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or the ADL, would have a copy of that letter before I did, if I ever got it at all. Even Jews get intimidated. Now, when the international solidarity movement began sending people over to the West Bank and Gaza, the San Francisco Chronicle decided to do a story. And the first group came back, and there was a press conference at the Arab Cultural Center. The majority of the ISM members were progressive Jews. And Jews have played a major role in the international solidarity movement. And the Chronicle reporter and photographer spent 2 hours there interviewing them. That's a long time. At the same time, the Chronicle was preparing to do a feature article on the Jewish Voice for Peace. By coincidence, it probably was by coincidence, or maybe not, a delegation from the Jewish Community Relations Council came to the Chronicle, accompanied by Walter Shorenstein, who at that time owned at least a third of the financial district of San Francisco, had donated $800,000 to Joe Biden's campaign for president, was a member of the AIPAC board of directors, and the most important Democrat in California. And what they accused the Chronicle publisher, who was Jewish, and the managing editor, who was Jewish, of being was pro-Israel. They had a pro-Palestinian bias, which of course is incredible. I mean, but they so intimidated the publisher and the managing editor. Phil Bronstein was the managing editor. I forget the name of the publisher. that they killed the story in the Jewish Voice for Peace, and they didn't do the story in the ISM. Since that time, whereas in the 80s, I used to place, as I mentioned, I used to place critics of Israel, mostly were Israelis, some Palestinians, but more Israelis came by, on TV and radio and get them interviews in the newspapers. And if I didn't do it, someone else had done it before, because the Chronicle had many stories in those days of Israelis who were critical of Israel, including Leah Zemmel, one of the most radical lawyers, probably the most radical lawyer in Israel, the only one who would take cases of terrorists, people accused of terrorism. Big story, feature story on the women's page. Today, the door is closed. I was able to get Robert Fisk an interview, the British journalist, in the magazine section at one time. But when, for example, Tanya Reinhardt, the late Israeli historian, came here, and then when Ilan Pappé, another Israeli historian known as revisionist, critics of Israel, came to the Bay Area, I called the Chronicle. I tried to get the Chronicle to interview them and tried to get them on their local TV, radio stations. And the door was closed. Ilan Pappé actually did get a chance to meet a Chronicle reporter who had covered the Middle East, because a Palestinian woman friend of the reporter said, please, I just want you to meet Ilan. So they came for breakfast. They met for breakfast, and the first thing he said to Pappé, as Pappé told me later, was, I'm not going to do a story on you. So this is a level of control at a local level. And San Francisco is particularly considered an important spot, but this goes on all around the country. And it's something people really should understand, that people who are going to fight this do not get rewards from, let's say, the pro-Palestinian community in the way that they're going to get leaned on by the pro-Israel community. Some years ago, you remember there was Kent Conrad, I think, was a cartoonist in the Los Angeles Times, one of the most important cartoonists in the country, and Conrad frequently upset the pro-Israel community in Los Angeles by making cartoons with, let's say, the Star of David with barbed wire during the Intifada. But what particularly got them upset was a cartoon that I suggested to him, when they were making the campaign to free Soviet Jews. At the same time, they were oppressing the Palestinians. So I said, I don't know Conrad, I just sent him a suggestion. My mother called me from Los Angeles and says, you should see Conrad's cartoon today. I said, what is it? She says, it's actually a religious Jew, Hasidic Jew, standing on the back of a Palestinian with a sign saying free Soviet Jews. And of course, they had a picket line all around the LA Times after that one. But this is what happens.
Could you elaborate? You touched on a million things. The ADL. How would you summarize them? They're so respected. They train FBI agents, whatever, police, all this stuff. Could you address that? And yet, they're the definitive, in the public's eye, organization against bigotry.
Okay, the ADL began in 1913 as an offshoot of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith was an organization. There were two organizations that were started by German Jewish immigrants, who were the most well-to-do among American Jews. And in the Jewish pecking order, the German Jews were on the top. You go on down, the Yemeni Jews were on the bottom. Okay. So the German Jews started the organization, and in 1913, a young Jewish office employee in the South, in Georgia, I believe it was, Leo Frank, was arrested and charged with the rape of a young office employee. And he was lynched. The only American Jew to be lynched. But if you ask people's names, name one person who was lynched, they can't name any black people who were lynched, the whole history, but they'll know Leo Frank's name. So the Anti-Defamation League began on the basis of the lynching of Leo Frank. And of course, given the times and the history, I could make a humor or make a joke about it now, but it was obviously something that Jews felt seriously, having come from Europe and feeling and having that history of anti-Semitism was something that they felt. But over the years, it was designed to fight bigotry against Jews. But as we saw starting in 1937, at least in 1937, it had already started keeping files on progressive Jewish Americans. And this was revealed actually in 1947 in a hearing held in Congress in which it turned out that people who hadn't applied for civil service jobs were being already investigated by the government. And this is something I found quite by accident, but there were hearings held. And in the hearings, in the footnotes, it said that they got information from the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee, which was the other organization started by German Jews. The American Jewish Committee, I should say, is the foreign policy arm of the American Zionist or pro-Israel lobby, and is largely ignored, but it is an organization that goes around the world working for Israel in Latin America, in Europe, and Africa. So the ADL would put out a lot of publicity, they'd be in the public life, of not only, they said, supporting, defending Jews, but also any other people who had been victims of discrimination. And they have made statements like that. And they also spent a lot of time going after neo-Nazis and skinheads, all 2,000 of them. Having been on the ADL mailing list for quite some time, I see their mailings, and these mailings who go to Jews, American Jews, are designed, I say, to scare them, to keep them in line and keep them from speaking out against Israel. This essentially is one of the main jobs of all the major Jewish organizations. But the ADL, this is one of their main jobs, is by consistently reminding people of anti-Semitism and seeing it almost everywhere, except on the part of Glenn Beck or any of the right-wingers. They give the right-wing anti-Semites a waiver. They make rationalizations for them. But their target is American Jews, and to make American Jews not forget that all non-Jews are really against them. And this is, I didn't grow up in that kind of a Jewish family, but I know others who did, in which they believe that Jews, that to quote Yitzhak Shamir, they were born, and they learned to hate Jews in their mother's milk. And this is a serious problem, because when you grow up in an American Jewish household and you go to Jewish schools, day schools or high school, this is what you learn. And you look at the textbooks, that throughout the years that American Jewish kids read who don't go to public schools, they're totally racist, totally distort the history, and are patronizing toward the dark-skinned Jews, the Mizrahim, and the Sephardim, and totally dismissive of Arab Palestinians. So we constantly hear stories about how the Palestinian textbooks are anti-Semitic, quotas if Palestinians aren't Semites, that's another story. But the textbooks that American Jewish students get from the time they're growing up are anti-Arab, racist against Arabs. And they're not published by right-wing organizations, they're published by liberal Jewish organizations, the Union of Jewish Theological Seminary, Reformed Judaism. They have different names, they change their organizations, change their names from time to time. But these are not right-wing Jewish organizations that publish these books. They're published by mainstream liberal Jewish organizations.
Now this has come up before. In your view, what's been your experience, and what do you know about this idea that many in the Jewish community are raised with the idea that everyone hates us at root, and that's sort of the premise of modern Israel too. But there's also the discussion that in America, in the religious Amalek and Exodus.
Oh yes.
Could you discuss?
Yeah, when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, my father, who had been involved in Jewish community activities back in the late 40s, and in fact, although not a Zionist, he was a binational stater. he was a blacklisted writer in Hollywood. He had staged the biggest fundraiser for Israel in its history in Hollywood. But by 1956, he was the only public Jew to criticize Israel's invasion of Egypt with France and England. But in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, my father said on the phone to me, "They're just like Nazis. Go back and read Deuteronomy." So I went back, and I not only read Deuteronomy, I read much of what's called the Torah, first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it's a record of bloody, thirsty genocide. I mean, it's astonishing to me how, it's not just one, how non-Jews who read this and Jews who read it just don't see it. It's like the emperor has no clothes. You have the God who, after all, the Jews created, telling him to go into Canaan, and not just Canaan, elsewhere as well, and destroy everything. Take the land, that's your land, even though these people have lived there, it's your land. In other places, destroy these people who've never harmed them, and destroy everything, and occasionally, if the women are good looking, keep them. There's this wonderful quote we hear, if I forget these Jerusalem, let my left hand lose its cunning. 9 or 10 lines after that, there's a line that talks about how delightful it is, wonderful it is to bash babies' heads against rocks. It's in there. And so when I read this, I said, I understand where a certain segment of the Zionists are coming from. Because if you read some of the quotes from the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel who talk about Amalek, who come, there's somebody, Amalek will, in every generation there will be someone who will come after you, and you have to kill them before they kill you. So what is justified, it's not just, just don't turn the other cheek. Before they even hit your cheek, you wipe them out. And this is Israel's philosophy. There are people, and I've argued with anti-Zionist Jews about this, who tell me, Jeffrey, there's no connection between Zionism and Judaism. Well, these people have not read the Old Testament, because Zionism is the worst aspects of the Old Testament come to life. They went to take the land of Palestine. They had as much right to the land of Palestine in 1948 as they did in the book, because there was Canaan, and the Canaanites lived there, and they had never done any harm to the Jews, and yet the God who Jews created said, go to the land of Canaan. Now, if today someone committed a crime and said, God made me do it, they'd lock him up. There used to be someone in New York, son of Sam could have been a number of murders. He was actually Jewish, but he had been adopted. And he committed these murders, and they said, why? He said, God made me do it. Well, we've had other religions, of course, not just Judaism, and many of these genocides maybe never took place. I mean, we don't know they took place. But we know other massacres have taken place in the name of religion, other religions. Christianity is a wonderful, Islam, I mean, people believe that they have the word, and those who don't deserve to live. They are told by their leaders. But Judaism seems to have given a waiver. And so for me, I say, I was never religious. My parents were atheists. My grandfather was Orthodox on my father's side, and so was his father, but that was cut out there. And I was not brought up, I was brought up to be proud to be Jewish, but not that Jews are better than other people. There was no double standards. And this was very difficult. Some history. My father, although he was not a Zionist, was very involved in the Jewish community in Hollywood. And for example, the head of the Haganah, Moshe Sneh, stayed at our house. My father was a communist, like Mike will say that. And so was Moshe Sneh. He was in Hadash, the Israeli Communist Party. So he came and said to my father, I'd like to meet some wealthy Jews in Beverly Hills. So my father arranged a meeting with wealthy Beverly Hills Jews. And so a number of whom were socialists when they were young and didn't mind the idea of seeing a nice little socialist Israel. A little socialist Israel. Not socialist United States, mind you, but a socialist Israel. So Moshe Sneh, whose son is very active still, Ephraim Sneh, has been active in the Labor Party, or now Kadima. Sneh says to them, as my father told me, I want you to, all of you, to invest in Israel. And they said, aren't you going to have a socialist state? And he said, by the time we're socialist, you'll have your money back 10 times over. So when they're leaving, and I can remember this so vividly, my father told me, turned to Sneh and said, what kind of a communist are you? Good question. Later, in the early 50s, when Israel became a state, we would have a number of Israeli Jews who had been in Israel, come to our house and visit. And they had left Israel for one simple reason. They did not want to live in a racist state. That the stories they told made a big impression on me, because they shocked me, they made an impression on me, is that every time a Palestinian fedayeen, which is what the Palestinian resistance was called in those days, made an attack, someone who had lost their land or taken off the land, made an attack on an Israeli settlement, they had pogroms in the Arab Galilee, where the Arab 150,000 Palestinian Arabs had stayed. And they did not want to live in a country that did that. Then in mid-66, I'm traveling in Europe for the first time. And an Israeli woman approaches me at a table in Holland. And she tells me the same story. Her family left Israel for the same reason. I met after another Israeli who said the same thing. It was years before I met an Israeli who had a different story. So even though I grew up as traumatized by anyone who couldn't have been there by the Holocaust, because I grew up during World War II, so when I learned about it, I was ready to cut Germans in Germany in bite sizes. I've gotten over that. But I never transferred my feeling to Israel. Never. It was like the Holocaust was one thing, a horrible crime that had happened, and Israel was something else. And it wasn't until I didn't think, as a matter of fact, I didn't think about Israel. I was active in the anti-war movement. I was active with the Black Panthers. I was photographing the Black Panthers, and I'm photographing the anti-war movement, and also as an activist as well. I filled the entire day with meetings or taking photographs in the darkroom. It was a time of incredible energy people had in the 60s. And in 67, however, when Israel defeated Egypt, I first really became aware that something was wrong. The triumphalism in the Jewish community in Los Angeles was something that I found outrageous. It was if the Jews in Los Angeles or Beverly Hills, LA or North Hollywood had personally defeated the Egyptians. It was pretty gross, pretty horrible. But then I still didn't think much about it because I was more concerned with the Vietnam War. And I went to London, and I was a little tired of the movement here. It was getting to be, when the Chronicle was telling more truth about what was happening in Berkeley than the local Berkeley Barb was, I decided I was out of here. And I was living in London, and I got a letter from David Fenton, who is now a leading public relations person in Washington, but then was a 17-year-old, very precocious, very bright photographer working for Liberation News Service. The youngest person to ever photographed in Life magazine. A cover I think he may have had. He wrote to me in London asking me, as a Jew, would I be willing to go to Lebanon and Jordan and take photographs of the Palestinian refugees for a book that George Cavaletto and Sheila Ryan, the founders of Liberation News Service, were going to put out. And there were a couple of other possibilities of offers that I was going to take. One going to Sardinia to photograph U.S. military bases, which were totally secret from the American public that were there. I had spent some time in Sardinia, I knew about them. But I decided, I'll go to the Middle East, it's fine. And that changed my life. Because I did not go there as a Jew. I went there as a journalist, like I would have gone anyplace else.
May I ask, this comes
Sure.
up, the issue of an intense Jewish identity. This has come up, and certainly Michael Lerner has that. And do you have any insights on that? Give me an example. I interviewed Norton Mesvinsky.
No, I don't. I've met him. He's a very good guy. Yeah.
Very interesting book. He did Jewish fundamentalism in Israel, and very critical of some of the things.
With Shahag was a friend of mine. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I brought him on his last tour here.
Really? I interviewed the man who saved him from the Warsaw Ghetto. He's alive. He lives in Florida. His name is Paul. Isn't that amazing?
Shahag, who saved Shahag?
Yes.
The 11-year-old boy?
I saw the evidence.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But Norton Mesvinsky, every Saturday now, he studies with Chabad.
He does?
Yes, he does.
He's a very complex character.
Okay, but I pointed out to you, in general, there's a lot of, I interviewed a Jewish professor, Lawrence Davidson.
He's very bright.
I interviewed him, and he told me that, when in the 1967s, when the war came, there's people in SDS and all that, a lot of Jewish individuals left all that and went to Israel. And
that's right.
So the issue, and this comes up to the issue of what's called Jewish particularity versus all that, the whole thing about finally becoming Jewish, and that preempts all else. Could you discuss that?
Well, this is very interesting. What happened with the issue of Israel-Palestine and the left. There were a number of people that I knew, Todd Gitlin was one of them, who, when it came to universal values, identifying first as a human being or first as a Jew, they chose being a Jew. It wasn't a problem for me because I had not been raised to think that the Jewish identity was something separate from a universal identity. And Gitlin was very active in SDS. But he had a number of other people. Marvin Garson, who is the editor of the Express Times underground paper, probably the best underground paper in the country, which I took photographs for. That didn't make it the best. It was an excellent paper. Marvin Garson was a Zionist. He went over to live in Israel. He lives in Jerusalem. Quite a number of people. Saul Stern, Sid Zion, who were at Ramparts, were Beginites. I mean, ultra right-wing Jews, and I mean, literally as racist toward Afrikaners. I mean, excuse me, as racist toward Palestinians as, if not more so than Afrikaners were toward blacks. So this thing, you've seen. There's a lot of talk about how when the black community, the Black Panthers, subsided with the Palestinians, and that was caused a big split in the Jewish community. How could the black community side with the Palestinians, and we've done so much for them, right? That's another story. But for me, I found that decision for Jews who had opposed the war in Vietnam and supported the Black liberation struggle to side with Israel was totally inconsistent. But that was the experience When I came back from my first trip in 1970 and went to Los Angeles, I went to a meeting at the Unitarian Church in Los Angeles, which was a kind of a center for progressive gatherings. There was a Reverend Steve Fritchman there, who was one of the most outstanding progressive people in Los Angeles. And there was a meeting around the Middle East, and I stood up and spoke for the Palestinians, because these were all leftist communists or close. And people started screaming at me that I was an agent of Standard Oil. That was a standard reply. Then a debate took place between one guy, Charlie Katz, who was a friend of my parents, and there was one guy who was half Lebanese, half Jewish, and he would take the Palestinian side. And I spoke up at that meeting, and Charlie, who knew me, I knew since I was a kid, he accused me of being an agent of Standard Oil too. It was very, because they connected me with Fatah, which I never supported. I never supported Arafat, never. And then my parents had to break off friendships, long-standing friendships with many of their friends, because my parents simply did not have a double set of books. And when they couldn't go out to dinner, they used to have a minyan. My parents would have a minyan, 10 people get together every month, and these people were really close, and I was close to them too. But Israel broke them up. Palestine broke them up. My parents were not active at all on this issue. But you could not have a dinner without the issue coming up. And my parents just simply would not take a pro-Israel line. As a matter of fact, a wonderful story. My mother, before she died, was talking on the telephone to her cousin in New York, whose son had gone over to Palestine in '48 to fight for a Jewish state and was killed. And so my mother told me this, in her 80s, she told me this, that she was talking to her cousin in New York, and he brought up the fact that the poor, of course they were talking about everything, they didn't see each other for years, but they'd get on the telephone. And poor Jacob, getting killed over there for Israel, and she said he shouldn't have been there in the first place. So that's the kind of environment I grew up in. It's interesting, the number of the progressive Jews, the majority of them, I would say, however, have come down on the side of the Palestinians. Not anti-Israel as much as pro-justice. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, and you may appreciate the story as a fellow Luddite, 4 or 5 of us who were in a group called Jewish Alliance Against Zionism, or JAZ, met at a delicatessen in San Francisco. There was after a rally against the Israeli invasion, and we came up with a plan. We were going to take an ad out in the Chronicle and the Examiner, half-a-page ad, which would say, in essence, in the headline, "Menachem Begin does not speak for us." And we wrote a text, we worked out a text, and we agreed we would try and get 4 days to get as many signatures as we can get. And we got, in 4 days, using the telephone, well, actually 299 Jews and 1 Christian who I thought was Jewish. Her name was Kristen, but I should have known. Anyway, and we ran this ad. The Chronicle made us modified a little bit of the text, but essentially not much. We ran this ad, a half a page in the Chronicle and the Examiner. They gave us a good deal too. The ad got national publicity on CBS News and published in Time magazine. And a number of years later, just last year, in the age of modern technology, there was a boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolution that the student council in Berkeley were voting on. And there was a group who was organizing it, decided to get Jews to sign this resolution in support of the resolution. And only Jews. And I no longer sign those statements anymore. I think this is an American problem. And to preserve it to Jews, we could talk about that a little more, is a mistake, because this is an American problem. And if only Jews speak out on it, it doesn't encourage others to speak out. They come to believe it's a Jewish thing. In any case, I would not sign it, but they had 4 or 5 weeks, it seems, with the internet, with Facebook, with email and everything else to get signatures. They got 187 in 4 weeks with all the technology. We got 300 in 4 days just by the telephone, which shows me that we had an anti-war movement without the internet. That was an incredible anti-war movement. Now, with all this technology, we have no movement. Now, there are other reasons for that, and we see the technology was actually been used over in the Middle East for all those uprisings, and they would not have occurred, I believe, without that. But of course, they're coming from living in societies that are repressive, and ours has a lot of inequalities, but it's not yet a police state, and those are police states, and so we can say anything we want here, and do, and nothing happens. Nobody sees a spark and rises up. But over there, communication is dangerous. If you speak in a cafe and somebody says, overhears you, and they're a police agent, and the police agents are everywhere in this country. So and that's an interesting point. It's a little digression, but this showed to me, and as most of the Jews I know, they may not agree with my position, for example, on the power of the Israel lobby, but there's no question that they support the rights of the Palestinians, a sense out of justice and their universal values.
What about a guy like Lerner? I mean, there's a lot of controversy within the critical community of Israel, the individuals who are Jewish. Some people have said that, well, Lerner at root is a Zionist, and therefore, his interview was very interesting. I mean, that there's some argument that the progressive Jewish community or the peace movement is subverted by Jewish Zionists, mainly, who want to pull back criticism.
I think the role that Lerner and the Zionists play is defined by what their goals are. They refuse to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions targeting Israel. They do not support ending aid to Israel. Here is a country that is a European lifestyle, and even without the problems with the Palestinians, has no basis. There's no basis for Israel to receive any money from the United States. They not only receive money, but there hundreds of organizations are tax exempt, so tax dollars that would have gone into the American Treasury go over to Israel. This is a unique situation, and it's not justifiable. These are things that Lerner and those people don't talk about. So every material means of bringing pressure upon Israel, Lerner and these kind of Zionists oppose. They also suppose the singling out of the pro-Israel lobby for controlling Congress, when in fact a number of Israelis say that. Uri Avneri has been saying it for years, and he's a Zionist actually, but Uri Avneri is a different kind of Zionist. Matti Peled, the general I spoke about, was a different kind of Zionist. He came over here and told the public here, in meetings here, told Jews here that they should aid Israel needed to be cut. And he walked out afterward and said to me, I don't think they even heard what I was saying. So to me, there are different dividing lines. The fact that someone says they're a Zionist or someone says they're anti-Zionist or Zionist is less important to me than the positions they take on dealing with the issue. One of them is ending aid to Israel, not suspending aid to Israel, ending all forms of aid to Israel. Just on the basis, there's no basis to give them aid. I mean, that's at the minimum. For what they have done with that, there is absolutely no basis. But even if Israel was a land of horn and plenty, if there was no if there's no oppression of the Palestinians, there'd be no reason to give them U.S. taxpayers' dollars, especially when we have people going without here, and I don't have to go into that, you know what we're talking about. The other thing is to recognize the power of the Jewish establishment, which is the Zionist establishment. To distinguish it from the overall Jewish community, and don't be dishonest about it by saying, well, how can you say that, Jeffrey? The majority of Jews were opposed to the war in Iraq, even more so than the general population. My answer is that the majority of Jews are irrelevant. It's those Jews who give money to politicians, and the majority of the Democratic Party money has come from Jews consistently, at least 60% for years, and this is a figure that is generally accepted by both the pro-Israel lobby and as critics. For example, in the year 2000, the last year they did it, Mother Jones magazine had a special which they called the Mother Jones 400, started in 1996. In 1998 and 2000 they did it, in which they provided a list, they published a list, or at least on the internet in one situation, they published a list of the top 400 individual donors to both political parties. So I went through the 2000 list, and it was quite revealing. 7 of the top 10 were Jewish, 12 of the top 20, and at least 125 of the top 250 were Jewish. I stopped counting then. I seem to be the only person who noticed it, and in an article that I wrote for a magazine called Left Curve, that was included in an article in a book called The Politics of Anti-Semitism, published by Counterpunch magazine, I mentioned this figure. The whole list disappeared from the Mother Jones site. It's not available since it was not in the magazine itself. Now, there are many things that have been on the internet for years, but you cannot find that list anymore. So getting back to this, so for me, the recognition, the differentiation between the organized Jewish community and the majority of Jews is really important. The majority of Jews, as I say, most of them are silent because they have been the target of the minority. To keep them silent, they don't want to do something that might bring harm on Jews. And as I say, since I'm on the mailing list and email list, both snail mail and email of major Jewish organizations, I see what they get. And if I was someone who had been brought up to believe that the whole world is against the Jews, then I would be scared by what I read. And so it is. So this is something that isn't discussed very much. That the fact that I believe the main target of the Israel lobby propaganda are American Jews. That's number one. And then the churches, the black community, Latino community is a major target right now and they admit that because of the growing number of Latino voters. But it's important as I say, for me it's a litmus test to recognize the power of the Israel lobby and the notion that Israel is an asset, a strategic asset to the United States is taken by only two sectors of American society: the Israel lobby and the left. It's ironic, but you find all the foreign policy experts who support U.S. global hegemony no longer think that Israel is an asset. They say it's a liability. That's people, Anthony Cordesman, but people have been saying this for a number of years, and in the Israeli press themselves, immediately after the end of the Cold War, Israelis from the left to right, thanks to Israel Shahak, I was able to read these, who used to do translations before they were published, the Israeli press was published in English online. You had Israelis in Likud as well as Labor saying Israel's no longer an asset, and it's most important now for American Jews to put pressure on Congress. And I have the quotes in articles from the Israeli press, to put pressure on Congress to stay strong for Israel. And ironically, it's the left, the only sector of American society outside of the Zionists, that take this position, that Israel is still an asset. So you have, Noam Chomsky is most notable on this. I wrote an article for Left Curve magazine called Noam Chomsky, Damage Control, Noam Chomsky and the Israel-Palestine conflict, in which I went through all his writings. And even Israel Shahak, who was a friend of Chomsky's, admitted to me in a letter in 1991 that Chomsky didn't understand, that he ignores the role of the executive, the presidency, and ignores the role of Congress, and is very stubborn about this Israel being an asset. And I think the reason for this is, if Israel is not supported as an asset, then why is it supported? And the answer would only be because of the power of the organized Jewish community, and that would be, quote unquote, blaming Jews. And there's something visceral, I believe, in many Jews from the way they've brought up, that when you hear blaming Jews, that a wall goes up and they cannot think straight and accept the reality.
Chomsky would be in that paragraph?
Chomsky is the most important perpetrator of that is what he is known for, this position, and he will not debate it. And when in 1991, when we were friendly, I mean, we had actually a debate on paper in the old National Guardian in 1991. And a mutual friend, or a friend of mine, who was one of 1,000 Jewish children that Roosevelt allowed in and was saved from the Holocaust and became a very strong supporter of the Palestinians, wrote to Chomsky in 1991 and to me, suggesting that we have a debate at the Social Scholars Conference in New York in 1992, and on the issue of the power of the Israel lobby, and Chomsky declined, saying, quote, it wouldn't be useful. I also asked my friend Professor Joel Baden here in Stanford, who took the same line as Chomsky, if he would debate the issue, and he told me it wouldn't be useful. I also had a public exchange with Phyllis Menace, who I've known for many years, in which she said the issue of the lobby is dead. This is about 5-6 years ago. And a mutual friend, a former Israeli Jew anti-Zionist in Iceland, Elias Davidson, wanted to get Phyllis and I together. So he said, what do you want from Phyllis? I said, I want her to debate me. And she wrote a letter back to him saying, Jeffrey and I agree on almost everything, which is true. She's a very bright person, and she explains American policy, except for this part, in a very clear, precise way. But she said, as far as debating about the issue of the lobby, quote, it wouldn't be useful, the same words. So they're very influential. Stephen Zunis, who doesn't happen to be Jewish, takes the same position. And so what happens is you have most of the people who are asked about this issue saying it's U.S. as an asset, but in fact, they're the only ones who do this.
Man, I have a lot of questions. You're a great interview and a fantastic. Bless your heart. I've interviewed, for example, Daniel Pipes, and guys like that argue their position is that there's an unholy alliance with the left and the Islamic community. That's the opposite of what you say. So what's your take on that?
There's no connection between the left and the Islamic movement. Take, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is totally misunderstood in the United States, because Hezbollah and I have been over there and visited in Lebanon. I've spent several visits to Lebanon. They are supported by the largest Christian party in Lebanon and a number of small parties, which is never reported in the American press. General Michel Aoun, a former president of Lebanon, is allied with Hezbollah. Hezbollah gets no support from the American left. In all the years they fought against Israeli occupation, they never had any protest, any support here from the American left. And Hezbollah, as I say, is much more open to other religions and to non-religious people than any other group that I'm aware of in the Middle East. Now, in terms, there are Americans who support, and the Palestinians, who they may not support Hamas directly, but their position is, essentially it was like Chomsky's position, I'm not a Palestinian, I support the Palestinians' right to choose whoever they want to represent them. But there is no alliance, to my knowledge, between any segment of the American left and any known Islamic organization. Yeah.
I think part of his argument, I think, was that, the left is an apologist, multiculturalism. They're protective of, in Pipe's kind of view, of this resurgent militant Islam, and the left is there to protect it, shield it. That's, I think...
Yeah, I think Pipes is actually one of the most important perpetrators and most effective perpetrators of Islamophobia in the world. You'll remember the situation over the cartoons that were published in the Danish paper. Denmark is a very strange place. The Mossad has had a very strong position in Denmark for years. And the irony is the cultural editor of the Danish paper was not only not a Dane, he was Jewish. He came to visit Daniel Pipes and interviewed Daniel Pipes for the paper. And then he went back to Denmark and started this campaign, this cartoon campaign. Not cartoon campaign, but a cartoon contest, rather, to depict Mohammed. This, I believe, is Pipe's idea. When it first ran, it was largely ignored. And then someone, because I believe that the Israelis have agents in the Arab world, it's obvious they do, was able to get and publicize this and inflame what they call the Arab street, the religious Muslim, who now were seeing a crusade against them waged by the President of the United States. Because George W. Bush called the war on Islam a crusade. Well, he didn't call it a war on Islam, he called it a war on Afghanistan and then Iraq. But he used the term crusade, and while he then took it back, that word has a resonance throughout the region. But I would say there is no evidence that I'm aware of. When I was in Gaza in 2004, I went there with the Middle East Children's Alliance. We went to a number of different places. I had no contact or saw anyone in contact with Hamas there.
Can I jump back?
Yeah.
Let me sound you out about this. You're very interesting. I interviewed a professor, a Jewish professor. He did a book on anti-Semitism in America, and we were talking. He gave me a very long time. And at some point, there's a paradox for me, looking at this, because he started talking about Yiddish. He started talking about how goy and shiksa and all those categorically pejorative, and it's completely dismissive of non-Jews, and it's just all this stuff. Yet he wrote a book on anti-Semitism, and I asked Michael Lerner about this kind of thing. There's a racist direction both ways, and Lerner, and I think most Jews' position is, well, it's a consequence of oppression through history, so you give it a pass, which is to say the Jewish side of the whatever bigotry.
Right.
Could you elaborate? Do you have any sense about that?
Anti-Semitism is the glue that holds the Jewish community together. No other oppressed group would say the same thing. Anti-black racism does no good whatsoever for blacks. Anti-immigrant racism or anti-Latino racism doesn't help at all Latinos. They don't raise money behind it. The black organizations don't raise money behind it. Anti-Semitism is as I mentioned before, anti-Semitism is necessary either to talk about it or to warn about it or to provoke it, is absolutely necessary to maintain the whole Zionist operation. And if it disappeared, the greatest fear, even more of than Palestinian, the greatest fear of the Jewish community today is assimilation. They are worried about the end of the Jewish community. And the fact that the Jewish community population is the only one that doesn't seem to change. It's always 6 million. Interesting figure, isn't it, too? I think that they keep talking about 6 million, 6 million, 6 million, so 6 million stays in your head. There has to be more. I mean, but it's true, many Jews are marrying outside of Judaism. Because in a sense, most Jews at a certain level understand it as a religion. I mean, it's a very complicated situation, but there's a cultural Judaism, there's different kinds of Judaism. But I think there is within Judaism, within the Jewish community, there has been this racism against non-Jews, this chauvinism against non-Jews, the use of the word Schwarze in the black community in New York. Maids were referred to as your Schwarze. I mean, this isn't from my family, but not my immediate family, but I saw that.
I gotta change my battery.
This is a. It's in there. I mean,
if you're a real soft-spoken, it might be a big, but you're kind of impassioned with what you say. So you were talking about the term Schwarze and all that.
Yeah, I mean, Stokely Carmichael made a big issue of this because he went to the Bronx High School of Science in New York City, which was the best high school in New York. Is this recording now?
Yeah.
Okay. This is no red light. This doesn't have a red light, does it?
I have it off, no.
Oh, good, yeah, okay. Stokely Carmichael, who is really a brilliant guy, and he built up a lot of resentment. His mother was a maid in New York, and he talked about how the Jewish women looked down on their maids as my thoughts, you know, that kind of, not just I was just like personal slave, you know, kind of thing like that. But there's a preoccupation, a Jewish preoccupation with blacks in America. It stems from a number of different reasons, and it's a long process, but Jews were very active in the formation of the NAACP, even being presidents and heading legal committees, and they believed that they were entitled to do this. Somehow they believed that the Jews had suffered more than other people in the world, which is not true. Israel Shahak said Jews have suffered sometimes more, sometimes less than other people, but Shahak, of course, was a Holocaust survivor, so he spoke with some knowledge of this. But whole peoples have been wiped out. They don't exist anymore. Jews have come through very well. I mean, what other peoples have suffered a genocide and come out smelling like roses? Certainly the Cambodians have not recovered. The Rwandans have not recovered. And so this is, anyway, getting back to the blacks and Jews, there was a Jewish fascination with black culture, which is an honest fascination, with black music. And so Jews were very instrumental in pushing blacks into improving the situation of blacks in the American music scene. Some exploited that, but some very honestly did that. My father, who was a screenwriter, but also was a producer, was executive producer of the first black musical in the United States called Jump for Joy, in which he, with Duke Ellington, Lena Horne, Ivy Anderson, but he gave he gave Dorothy Janders her first role, and we had a number of black friends. I grew up in Los Angeles, and my parents had a number of black friends. It was just a normal thing. To me, it didn't seem. Paul Robeson sang my sister and I to sleep. We had a chance to meet amazing people, and yet Duke Ellington, for example, was a very good friend of my father's, and I knew him later. But this didn't seem unusual. It was very unusual, and my sister and I, we were very privileged to grow up in this kind of a household because my other Jewish friends didn't have this same opportunity. So, my father was really, sincerely devoted to ending racist cause, but he was also fighting anti-Semitism. He didn't take anti-Semitism. There was accusations by people like Michael Lerner, for example, Todd Gitlin, that Jews aren't concerned with anti-Semitism. They were only concerned with other people's struggles. Well, the truth of the matter today, anti-Semitism is virtually non-existent in the kind of the ways it was in the time when you had restricted covenants in which Jews couldn't live in certain neighborhoods or couldn't stay in certain hotels. My father used to call hotels and make reservations with a British accent, which he could develop under a non-Jewish name, and then call back a few minutes later and ask for a reservation or cancel a reservation. Oh no, he'd call it under a Jewish name and there'd be no reservations. And then he'd call back a few minutes later with a non-Jewish name and then there would be reservations. And so then he would get on the case. But for me, and I fought that as well. At certain times when I was growing up and in my 20s, when I occasionally ran into some Germans who made rationalizations or lies about what happened in Germany. I physically attacked them. And even in my 30s, I went on a date with a German woman, and I said after a while, I said, it's nothing personal. I have a thing with Germans. So I took what had happened and internalized that, and it wasn't until I went to Italy and accidentally met some Germans who had been in German SDS that I got over it very quickly. Actually, but I was nearly arrested. I was nearly arrested on a German train in 1966, traveling through a German train, because I was sitting in a first-class car, being invited there by a German woman who had worked in a kibbutz in Israel, and the German the German train conductor was wearing like a Nazi uniform. I called him Scheisskopf, and I nearly was arrested. I wouldn't let him. He took my passport. I wouldn't let him out of the compartment until he gave me my passport back. But I've gotten over this. But today, to tell you the truth, the classic anti-Semites, and there are those around, I find really kind of dirty. But they don't bother me in the same way viscerally that they used to, because what Israel's doing today and what their supporters are doing today far outweighs anything that someone might say about Jews this and Jews that. Most Americans aren't going to buy that. We have 40 members of Congress are Jewish. We have 2 states of California. The senators, California and Wisconsin, are Jewish. Excuse me. What they're talking about, there's a term they use, Jew hatred. They love that term, Jew hatred. The only people who use that term, of course, are Jews. Jew hatred is like, oh, it's the worst thing in the world. But the reality is, there are people who hate Jews, and I've gotten into arguments with them on the internet because they think because I'm a critic of Israel in the Israel lobby, I'm one of them. And then they find out that I'm not, and then I'm just like every other Jew. Okay. Those people are such marginal people. Sometimes I think they even are created, that they're fictional people created by the Anti-Defamation League to be so outrageous. But in American society, it's quite clear that, well, even Americans who may think Jews have too much power can even not be classified as anti-Semitic. It's just a recognition of reality.
May I ask, this
Yeah.
comes up a lot. I mean, who exactly do you view as your nemesis? And so again, the Jews is, that's easily dismissed, bigotry, what have you, but some people say it's the organized Jewish community. I interviewed Mark Ellis. He said that he calls them Constantinian Jews, Zionists. There's all these categories that people decide, well, it's not the Jews, it's this. Where do you fall in all that?
Mark Ellis is one of the I've met Mark Ellis, heard him speak, and he's one of the more intelligent commentators. Maybe he's among the most intelligent commentators on this subject, and he's been doing it for years without the kind of recognition he merits. I see the organized Jewish community, Jewish establishment, not so much the rank and file, because they're locked into this, but they are a major problem, and they're a major problem for in the long run for the country, because I think what's happened, the Jewish establishment, the Zionist lobby are the same thing. The organized Jewish establishment, this is both secular and religious, has one major subject, one major focus, and that's the protection of Israel. There was a Jewish congressman, Metzenbaum, Howard Metzenbaum from Ohio, back in '91, told a meeting of the National Meeting of Jewish Community Relations Councils that, as far as Congress is concerned, the only issue that concerns American Jews is Israel. And the conference proved it. By the time they finished talking about issues dealing with Israel, there was no time in the weekend conference to talk about any other subject. So what's happened is Israel, as Israel Shahak once said, Israel has become the God of the American Jews. Some people say the Holocaust has become the God. So I say the Holocaust is like the Holy Trinity. But it is, I have to say, in 1970, when I was in Jordan, when I was in Lebanon, I hadn't been to Israel yet, but I could see Israel. I could see Israel across the border. I could see across the Jordan River. I was standing in a town that had been deserted on the east bank of the Jordan because Israel had shelled it. So it was a whole village, nobody in it. We were down there, and I realized, and I told people when I came back that I believe that Israel, the creation of Israel, will have been the worst disaster in Jewish history, because it will be a self-inflicted wound. There will be no sympathy for Israel if it goes under. Less and less all the time. The Europeans are tired of it. In Mendocino County, most people, the mainstream churches are a good indication of this. The mainstream churches were a target of the Israel lobby from the very beginning. The belief that Americans are just naturally supportive of Israel is a fallacy. The organized Jewish community, even before Jews were interested in Israel, which they really weren't, most of them until '67, the organized Jewish community, the American Zionist Council, the predecessor to AIPAC, was sending journalists to Israel, was delegations of church people and newspaper people were being sent to Israel to indoctrinate them to be supportive of Israel. One of the most critical pieces was an article written by Martha Gellhorn. Martha Gellhorn was the most important woman journalist, war correspondent in World War II, one of the wives of Ernest Hemingway, wrote for the Atlantic Monthly, was one of the, which was the intellectual magazine of America in and after World War II, the Atlantic Monthly. She had two loves in her life, the Spanish Civil War, but she had been a communist, or close to being a communist, and Israel. So she went over to Israel in 1961, and she wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly about the Israeli Arabs, which was a hate piece, one of the most racist pieces of writing I've ever seen. And the American Zionist Council sent a copy of this article to every member, every person listed on Who's Who in the United States. Then a Zionist publicist sent, what's his name? The guy who wrote Exodus, Leon Uris, was sent to Israel to write Exodus as a propaganda piece for Israel. So the American people, not just Jews, in this case, the larger American public was targeted to become supportive of Israel. So it isn't some automatic thing that Americans support Israel more than the French or the English or other people, Italians do. The others, of course, are anti-Semitic. But it was actually a planned program. It was a propaganda campaign, and a very successful one, which was all documented in declassified files recently released to the American Zionist Council that the Israeli lobby archives has on the internet. So the Protestant churches were a major target, and they were very, very supportive of Israel. They no longer are, because I would say that if you want to talk about decent American human beings, the mainstream clergy basically has a large percentage of the decent Americans can be found in the Presbyterians and Methodists and so on, who basically believe in a decent Jesus, in a humanitarian Jesus, and not a Jesus, not the one of the extreme evangelists and so on. And the mainstream American church, the Protestant church, has moved away from Israel. And they're constantly battling with the Zionist establishment, which when they try to pass resolutions on boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, they are really attacked and lobbied by the Zionist establishment not to pass these. And most of the time they finally back off because they're called anti-Semitic. Now, one of the reasons that people like Rupert Murdoch, for example, who is probably more Zionist than anyone else, has been given numerous awards by Jewish organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League, like Humanitarian of the Year awards. That was presented by Henry Kissinger to him. They recognize Jewish power. That if the Sean Hannity's, Glenn Beck's, we see what happened to Glenn Beck when he accused George Soros of being George Soros, a Hungarian survivor who was a kid in Hungary and was forced and passed off as a Christian, was forced to go around with a person he was living with when they were taking money and valuables from Jewish homes. Glenn Beck said he was an ally of Hitler, and Glenn Beck had to back off. The fact is, since in so many aspects of the media, there are very important Jews there, that if Rupert Murdoch in his publications was to take a critical position on Israel, he could be attacked as an anti-Semite. And there are enough people writing in other papers that he doesn't control that he would be on the defensive. And so in that situation, it's like a mutual recognition of power. They don't attack Murdoch, he doesn't attack them. And people don't understand this. I'll tell you something else about the media here. You recall when Richard Nixon tapes were published after his death, and Billy Graham was recorded telling Richard Nixon in his second term he had to break the Jewish control of the media. And Nixon said to him, do you really believe that? And Billy Graham said, yes. And Nixon said, so do I, but you can't say it. So Nixon, of course, recorded everything. And so when this tape came out, the recording came out, Billy Graham tearfully apologized. And Nixon, of course, couldn't be resurrected. They tried, but they couldn't resurrect Nixon. And, yeah.
No, go.
No, and so nobody seemed to say, well, these are Billy Graham and Richard Nixon. If anybody who would know who controlled the media, they would know. I mean, they knew, you know, these are two important people. So I started keeping a list using the Jewish Forward and the New York Times business section. And what I generally knew otherwise, and the Jewish press, which a number of papers I subscribed to religiously. And after a while, I gave up for a while. Because now I've resumed it. It's just too overwhelming. It's too overwhelming. And I was saying, I was saying that we have to. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, and I say these lists do not conclude Jews like Bob Scheer or Phil Weiss of his great blog Mondo Weiss. Or Glenn Greenwald, Robert Greenwald. The only people I have on the list are people who have supported Israel essentially in the mainstream media, including liberals like, you know, Rachel Maddow and people like that. But you know, it's an amazing list. I mean, the New York Times, for example, their two correspondents, Ethan Bronner and Isabel Kirshner. Kirshner is probably an Israeli. She's married to Hirsch Goodman, who is a former editor of the Jerusalem Post and Jerusalem Report. Ethan Bronner's son is in the IDF. There's a real conflict of interest there. I mean, no other publications would allow this to happen. But when it comes to this, what I call the Israel exception. And so, but when I bring up this thing about the media, people have done no research at all to try and deny it. But take the New Republic. It's a total pro-Israel magazine. Marty Peretz, the editor, makes no apologies about it. You have a situation where Harper's Magazine has run some articles. Actually, Time Magazine has crossed them recently on a couple of articles. But in terms of the networks, you have Martin Indyk is virtually on every Sunday. Martin Indyk, an Australian who Bill Clinton brought over and made him ambassador to Israel and rushed his citizenship through, and he was a former member of AIPAC and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. They have all these think tanks, and the money issue. Haim Saban, who was one of the big donors to the Democratic Party, in 2002 he gave $12.3 million to the Democratic Party, which is only $1.5 million less than the arms industry political action committees gave to both parties. $7 million of that built the Democratic Party headquarters in Washington. Saban, he likes 1, 2, 3. He donated $12.3 million to the Brookings Institution, the last independent think tank in Washington, to create the Saban Center on Middle East. And of course, who heads that but Martin Indyk, the same one.
So the ADL would rush in and say it's irrelevant to categorize Jews as by definition anti-Semitic and Jew-related.
He's not just the Anti-Defamation League. I've argued with left-wing Jewish anti-Zionists who say the reason the lobby is powerful is that its interests line up with those of U.S. imperialism. And the fact that the great majority of neocons are Jewish is irrelevant. The fact that the overwhelming majority of money, or the majority of money that goes to the Democratic Party, big money, is Jewish is irrelevant. That everything that in which Jews are identified is irrelevant, and it tends to rationalize or racialize something that shouldn't be racialized. That the fact that Israel and the U.S. military-industrial complex are tied together is much more important. But before that happened, the lobby was very strong, so the idea that if someone is Jewish is only important when that someone is like Jonas Salk or Albert Einstein, but not when they're Richard Pearl or Paul Wolfowitz or Douglas Feith, or the fact that Douglas Feith, Richard Pearl, and David and Merab Wormser, Jewish neocons, wrote a piece called The Clean Break in 1996, advising Benjamin Netanyahu to go after Saddam Hussein and shut down negotiations with the Palestinians, and the fact that they all went into the Bush administration and were orchestrating and pushed the war and even took credit for the war in Iraq when it seemed to be going good. This is all considered irrelevant. So to me, it is important that these people are Jewish. It's also important that it is not the Jews. So people say, you say it's the Jews, and I say no. They are trying to get around that by saying I say it's the Jews, but it isn't. It is the Jewish establishment, though. The Jewish establishment, they have different levels. They have a public level, and they have an organization. Oh God, it's been over 2 hours, 15 minutes already. Yeah. I'm supposed to be somewhere at 7 in the city. Oh yeah, actually, 50.
I interviewed Jack Shaheen.
What?
Jack Shaheen.
I don't know him. I know who he is.
Okay, he did a book on Hollywood depiction of
Yeah.
Arabs. Does the fact that there's a large Jewish prominence in Hollywood or in Zionist prominence, is that a factor in how Arabs are depicted?
Yeah, well, Hollywood created all the racist stereotypes. All the racist stereotypes. It's something that is people don't want to deal with. Marlon Brando attempted to do that, and he was forced to apologize, and tearfully, when he suggested that Jews who know something about oppression should be more. I forget his exact quote, but should be more careful about how they portray people in the movies, and he had to tearfully apologize about that. The Jews who started Hollywood were not Zionists. They were in it simply to make money, and it was an industry that they could get into, which nobody else was into. And they weren't interested in the Jewish community either. The famous quote, Harry Cohen, who had the Columbia Studios, once was asked to give the Jewish relief. He said, give the Jewish relief, how about relief from the Jews? And that actually was published in an ad in the Jewish Forward by the American Jewish History organization. But they created, but they were Europeans, and they were racist toward non-Jews. And so they created the stereotype of blacks and Mexicans and Native Americans, and of course Arabs, even before there was an Israel. Or the romantic Arab, you had Rudolph Valentino, who was an Arab, of course. But since then, but now they've become much more politicized, and TV is essentially also television as well. So when you speak about the media, all aspects of the media are covered. There's no opening there. Once in a while, let's say like you'll get a good program. Someone will sneak it through. But Mike Wallace, for example, at 60 Minutes, was under attack because he honestly portrayed I forget what year it was, but there was a massacre on the Temple Mount of Palestinians by Israeli police. And he reported it accurately and came under attack by the Jewish establishment, the ADL camera, the Committee for Accuracy in Media and Middle Eastern Reporting. And I sent him the report from the Israeli press from Israel Shahak. And one day I come home and there on my answering machine is a long message from Mike Wallace, which I played for my mother, who was a great admirer of Wallace. But Wallace was a decent guy. And he wrote in his memoir about being pressured by the Zionist lobby. He's not the only one to do that. So there are a number of Jews in the media who've tried. But what they're up against is a well-organized establishment of letter writers, phone calls, and donors. GM, no, I forget, the Boston NPR station is one of the biggest. CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting, happens to be based there, and they decided to go after the NPR station because they claimed it was pro-Palestinian. And they cost the station $1 million in underwriting. That's the power they have. And this is something that unfortunately the anti-Zionist left never talks about. You see, the problem is if it's American, if Israel's an American asset, and Israel's supported because the positions of the lobby line up with the interests of American imperialism. And the lobby is not relevant, right? But what the lobby has done is silenced members of Congress and the media who would otherwise criticize it. When Americans were criticizing anti-apartheid, the apartheid in South Africa, when it came to Israel, the same congressman wouldn't talk about it. And in 1973, Arthur Hertzberg, a former president of the American Jewish Committee, revealed he made a deal with Charlie Rangel, the New York black congressman who has recently had to resign, that if Israel, that if the black caucus in Congress would not criticize Israel about what it did in South Africa and any other policies, the American Jewish community would support maintaining welfare for blacks. And welfare, let me tell you, having seen it in the schools, welfare has been one of the most destructive policies in American history for the black community. Criminally destructive. But you see, so that was dealing with the apartheid situation. The black caucus was silent. Ron Dellums, the California congressman, the darling of the liberals, pulled the plank out of the anti-apartheid legislation that had been put in by departing Senator Charles Mathias, that would have penalized Israel for selling arms to South Africa. And Dellums said, when I confronted him with this at a big meeting, anti-apartheid meeting in Berkeley, he said that one Democrat after another came to him and said, Ron, if you don't take the plank on Israel out of the bill, you have to take my name off it. And rather than publicly exposing these phony Democrats who are more loyal to Israel than against racism in South Africa, he caved. He caved. And they caved, and when it came to Israel and Guatemala, when Jimmy Carter stopped U.S. aid to Guatemala because of the genocide going there against the Indians, when Israel went in and provided 98% of the weaponry, the same members of Congress kept silent, as did the Solidarity Movement, which was also part of the problem.
Can I ask you about Chabad? What do you know about them? What's your perception on them?
Chabad is Chabad is a group of Messianic, ultra-religious Jews that proselyte in the Jewish community around the world. They're very politically powerful. The Moshiach, the one Menachem Shearson, who they believe was the Moshiach, the Messiah returning, was given the Presidential Medal as a humanitarian, despite the fact he was many quoted statements of his on video describing non-Jews as being subhuman, and also taking an ad out after the first Iraq War saying this showed that this is a victory for the Jews and God had intervened. The fact that Iraqis were killed meant nothing. And yet the Chabad gets everybody in Hollywood to go on their telethons. They literally control the politics of Los Angeles. They can do anything they want and break any kind of public ordinance and get away with it. As my friends of mine down there have told me. We can, I can't come back here tomorrow because I got to.
I might be.